Why don't we get to our guests now? Frank Seravalli of Daily Faceoff joining us. Frank has been busy. I thought that they'd be slowing down a little bit as the offseason comes up here. As Frank looks like he's got a target locked on him here on our StreamYard here. Geez, quads. I thought you were doing the hit later, but
my camera takes a minute to focus up, so I was seeing if you guys could hold up a sec, but it's all good.
Oh, it's all good. This is fun. This is fun, especially for the podcast listeners. Frank,
see it locked in on my eye, like quite creepily.
Actually, I'm a little confused by this thing. We have switched over, by the way, folks, who are tuning in here on YouTube from a different streaming device, and this one's it's creeping me out a little bit off the top. But Frank, we appreciate you jumping on the show here today. How's the off season been for you so far? Because I like I said, we've slowed down. We're not doing 5 shows a week anymore, but it feels like your shows, you have more news than you did kind of near the end of the regular season right now.
Yeah, it's actually just about as busy as it gets. So many coaching changes, management changes, talks are beginning to heat up on trades. 30 out of the 32 teams are in off-season mode. So that sort of gives you an indication of where a lot of teams' heads are at. And this is it. This is my Super Bowl these next few weeks. So I'm excited.
Frank, did the Leafs make a good decision with Bradford Living?
I think they did. Look, I think you can only judge a manager based on the situations and circumstances that they deal with. And I don't think people have a full appreciation for how wild it is to work for Murray Edwards in Calgary. I think people in Vancouver have a different appreciation for that. Like they get it. Like anyone, when I say that, people sort of nod their head. But in Calgary, like I think it's sort of low key, lower case. Like not everyone realizes how stressful it can be and the demands of that. And I also think too, like people would look at his tenure a lot differently if they didn't have Matthew Tkachuk decide that he's not going to resign, or if Johnny Gaudreau didn't, sort of kind of quasi agree to a deal to stay in Calgary and end up leaving at the last minute. Like all those things sort of change the complexion of it. And then the resulting Huberdeau and Weegar trade. Look, at the end of the day, he helped acquire a really significant core in an outpost and market that isn't always easy to do so in. So I think having the sort of unlimited resources of Toronto and having a really quality core that he inherits, I think makes it a really enticing hire.
Frank, as we stick with some around the league stuff, I got one more before we get to the Vancouver Canucks a little bit. The talk of the salary cap going up for a long time, it felt like a 6 months concrete stretch. We felt like it was $1 million. That's all we were going to get. And Canucks fans, they said, that's not great. We've heard you talk about a $3 to $4 million potentially going up.
I've been saying this forever.
Yeah, I know you have, and you really have hit it home over the past 2 weeks or so. So is this happening? What's going on with the salary cap?
Look, I firmly believe that the NHL knows in its own back pocket, in its own executive boardroom, that no one that's affiliated with the league wants to see a 4th straight season of a frozen salary cap. And more to the point, given that this debt from players to owners is scheduled to be paid off so early next season, it doesn't really even make a lot of sense. So there's going to be a massive increase 1 year from now. Why not try and preempt that instead of handing every manager a $7, $8, $9 million increase? Smooth it out for one. 2, players get more money in the system, so it's beneficial to them. And there's a way to do all of this without impacting the escrow cap that's already been negotiated. I believe that to be the case. The league wants something in return, as they are wont to do, and we'll see where it goes. We've got 3 weeks, essentially, maybe 4, to really figure this out and give teams an answer, because I wrote about 5 buyout candidates today, and you can't really make a judgment call on who you're buying out necessarily, regardless of when the window opens, until you really know what your salary cap upper limit is. And that may not come until June 26th-ish, with the NHL draft on June 28th.
Frank, you make a great case for everything making sense for the cap to go up. Why wouldn't it? Why would it stay at 1 million instead of 3 to 4, somewhere around that range? Why would this not happen?
The easiest answer for you is that the NHL wants to be difficult, that they are, sort of essentially for the first time since Marty Walsh took over as NHL Players Association executive director, they want to get something for it. That's traditionally how it's worked. Whenever the players ask for something, there's always an answer from the NHL. And if they want to be a stick in the mud, essentially all they have to do is point towards the memorandum of understanding, which just dictates very clearly if the debt is not paid off, if one penny, $1 has not been paid off on this debt, then the cap can only by formula increase by 1 million. So it's spelled out in black and white. The NHL doesn't have to do anything, yet whatever they would do, you guys have been around long enough to know that it's not going to be out of the kindness of their heart.
No kidding. Okay, speaking of kindness out of their heart, is there any team willing to take JT Miller this offseason, do you think?
I do think that there's a path. I think the Canucks have to properly adjust their expectations going in, because I think the easiest way to simplify this conversation is, would someone sign JT Miller at the contract that he's at heading into next season if he were to be a free agent this summer? And my answer is, on a contending team with this crop of free agents, if you believe JT Miller is a center and you see him as a sort of 85 to 90 point impact player in this league, the answer is probably yes. You can forget about the tail end and the term of the deal, because contending teams kind of always worry about that part of it later. It may be someone else's problem to deal with if you're a GM. But will they pay a premium on top of that contract and give the Canucks what they were asking for at the deadline, which was essentially 2 first-round picks? Will they do that and sign JT Miller to that type of contract as a free agent? I'm not convinced that's the case. And I think those expectations, it's a pretty similar conversation to the one that you would have about Erik Karlsson leaving San Jose and the cap implications of that deal, that you'd have to, sort of check those at the door and properly value the creation of the cap space in your own organization in order to do that. And I know that that's probably easier said than done, because it seems like the Canucks haven't properly valued that flexibility and space based on their actions to this point.
I think what's interesting, Frank, and you brought it up there, it's like the additional assets to not only just taking the contracts. I don't think the Canucks are looking to just get rid of this contract for nothing, like you said. And
because they want to be competitive.
Exactly. They're in the camp that I think a lot of people in Vancouver look at teams that they should be trading with. That seems to be what the Canucks think they are. And JT Miller is a perfect example, because you look at this free agency class. You've brought it up. I've heard you say this all season long. This is not a free agency cap where you got to start, saving your pennies because you want to spend money here. So how much is there going to be a player that even gets close to what JT Miller is making in free agency this year? Somebody getting anywhere near $8 million? Because then what I think is maybe a team would be willing to give up some assets to be able to take that contract, because there's just no one in the same stratosphere as
not
JT
even close. And that's really what lines up to make this a perfect sort of storm for the Canucks. This is exactly the type of year you'd want to be having this discussion. Could you imagine having it last year with a Johnny Gaudreau on the board or someone else that's a big-time, big-name free agent where there's still only limited dollars to go around? You're hitting it at the exact moment in time where, again, theoretically, the cap should be going up, well, for one, and two, it's a shitty free agent class. So you mash those two things together and the Canucks need for cap flexibility, and you say, this makes a lot of sense. However, are they going to find that there's the proper juice for that squeeze in order to part with the player? Because obviously they still like him. And you see the run that he had under Rick Tocchet, and you say, well, maybe he can be that guy. My concern with JT Miller has never really been the here and now. It's the later term for when the Canucks should actually theoretically be building for. That is really the core issue.
And that is going to be the interesting thing, because I don't think anybody knows what the thought is aside from people internally there, where the direction is, because you're right. It feels like the amount of paths that you could have taken are starting to be canceled out. And you're honestly at the point right now where what you've done with Philip Hronik trade and these other situations of moving high-end draft picks for players, you've kind of taken away the chance to rebuild. You're almost taking away the chance to retool with the contracts that are starting to come over the next couple of years here. It's going to be interesting to see. So I'm curious with that point, if the Canucks want to get competitive next season, and that seems to be the way that they're on their track right now, how much is that 11th overall pick in play, Frank? And I mean, it's the most consistently moved first round pick over the past 10 years in the NHL, the 11th overall pick. And the Canucks are holding on to it this year in a year where they want to get competitive next season. So how much in play is that 11th overall pick when you look at guys in the first round who have first round picks, I guess?
It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be in play at all. The Canucks should be drafting the best player available at that exact moment in time, relying on Patrick Allvin's scouting eye, and stockpiling that pick into this organization that desperately needs a prospect pipeline to be rebuilt around that player. You do as well as you can in that spot, and you hoard that jewel, so to speak. To think that the Canucks are going to move it for immediate gratification, I think just sets this team back another 5 years. Whatever the number is, maybe not 5, maybe an exaggeration, but the point being, this is also still somewhat of a historically deep draft class, and the Canucks have to be top of mind that this team hasn't made the playoffs. And you can think and feel whatever it is that you want about, oh, hey, look at the Florida Panthers, the 8 seed playing for the Stanley Cup. You didn't make it in. Mm-hmm. And frankly, more than that, you weren't really close. And to convince yourself from a couple years ago with Bruce Boudreau and the turnaround over the last 56 games of the year to then this bump that they got under Rick Tocchet, to be fooled by that again as, hey, if we could just be that team, we'll be okay. I think it's crazy. So look, somewhere someone is convincing themselves that they can be next year's Florida Panthers, that they can sneak into the playoffs and go to the final and have a chance to win. And they may be right. The Stanley Cup playoffs are the ultimate coin flip. Hockey is so incredibly random. But I just think from a 30,000 foot view, team-wide perspective, franchise building perspective, that shouldn't be the goal, is to sneak in and see if you can do some damage. It should be, we want to be the next Carolina Hurricanes. We want to be consistently excellent every single year and have a chance to win the Stanley Cup every year. That maybe you don't. Maybe you fall short. You know, Carolina's been to the conference final now twice in the last 4 years. Vegas, they're in a different stratosphere, a different situation because they were an expansion franchise, but 4 times in 6 years. And you look at the Lightning and some of these other teams. Washington, how many times did they get to the second round and lose? St. Louis, get to the second round and lose. At some point, you got to give yourself enough chances that when you're in the game and you're in the mix, that you can break through. And right now, the Canucks aren't in the mix. And to think that they're going to have one really good summer and it's going to lean towards 5 years of competitive greatness, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I'm not saying it's impossible, but to think that there's a quick fix right on the horizon for this team, like, unless you're going to magically rebuild this team's defense core, I don't think it's possible.
No, it's a team that needed a step back and has continued to just
power through.
So forward, right? Yeah, and I mean, power through would be great, but I think the steps are.
No, I'm saying they've tried to power through that notion of taking a step back. Why is that? Pride? Is that marketplace demand? Is it ownership push? Like, where does that come from? Because it's spanned multiple regime changes now that I don't really get it.
We're trying over here, Frank. We're trying to get it as well. One of the quick fixes that people have floated, Oliver Ekman-Larsson buyout. I know that this is something you've talked about a lot lately. This doesn't sound like it's happening in Vancouver, you believe?
No, I look, is it out of the realm of possibility? No. I still think you're dealing with $10 million in real cash savings, which I think should always be top of mind when you're looking at a situation like this. But the sheer length of it, how punitive the cap hits are, it's an easy, immediate gratification of, wow, you can wipe almost all of that off the books for the first year of the buyout. But essentially, I think if you were to do that, what you'd be doing is actually basically trading for Oliver Ekman-Larsson again. Instead of trying to wait through the pain that you're in with the cap, which they should have just done one more year and get all that flexibility that they've never gotten. Instead, they kicked it down the road. And that's really what this buyout will be doing. It's not as punitive because the Larsson deal is 7 and change versus it's 4 and 1 and all these different variables in the buyout structure, which you can see on Cap Friendly. But it's the overall notion of it that, yes, the cap's going up, and yes, those cap hits in the buyout are going to be less painful as they go on. Theoretically, we don't have a crystal ball and can't actually rule out that there will be some other crazy world-altering event like a pandemic. But that said, it almost feels like they need to try and gut this out as long as they can to make it as palatable as possible and just hope and pray that somewhere along the way, either Rick Tocchet or whatever happens, Oliver Ekman-Larsson finds some kind of Erik Karlsson rejuvenation, and out of the clear blue sky, he becomes the player that the Canucks thought they were trading for, and the Oliver Ekman-Larsson that everyone watched star in the NHL 7 years ago.
I heard you talking about this with Mike. I believe it was yesterday. Do you think there's any possibility that we can even see a small bounce back from Oliver Ekman-Larsson? This guy was below replacement level when he's playing last season.
Well, didn't you answer your own question? Like, the only way, theoretically, if you're already below replacement level, is up. At what point does pride kick in for that player to say, I've been subpar? I don't know if it's an attention to detail thing. I don't know if it's a motivation thing. Whatever it may be, he seems like he's lost. And when you consider the amount of money you're making, I don't know if he just shrugged and just like, this is an absolute shit show here. I think a couple players did that last season at a certain point. But you can't throw in the towel when you're being paid that much money. You have to have some sort of fire in you that makes you want to play for more than that to defend your own name.
Absolutely. Frank, you've had some fire in you. This is an incredible hit. Thank you so much for taking the time today. The chat's going nuts. They are loving it. A lot of them are saying, thank you, Jim. I believe that's a throwback to Jim Bradley a little bit. But good stuff, Jim Benning there. All right, Frank, appreciate you taking the time today. Excellent stuff. Thanks a ton.
Have a good one, guys.
Absolutely. There he is. Frank Seravalli joining us there. A lot to chew on there from Frank.